Hi everybody, welcome to session 4 of the Unity Project workshop here at Northwest Christian Convention. The first 3 sessions were all re-recordings of material that was presented at the first Unity Project gathering in February. And the purpose of that gathering was to ground this project in scripture and in our common heritage in the Stone Campbell movement as a launching point for this mission of unity. And that mission of unity is the idea that unity is very practical, and it needs to be brought to where the rubber meets the road in our ministries. And so next year's Unity Project is going to focus on how we build unity within our congregations. And the Unity Project in 2022 is going to talk about how we build unity in our communities. And we have this vision of unity being a very practical and essential part of mission for the church. And this year, that has been more vividly displayed than ever. And so what we wanted to do for the last 2 sessions is to bring together Christian leaders from across our movement and from across different types of churches to have a conversation about what it has meant to seek unity during this COVID-19 crisis. There have been a lot of challenges to churches. How do you keep a church united when you're not meeting in the same building, when you disagree on how to respond to government regulations and how to keep people safe? And there have been a lot of challenges that have come out of that. And so we've got a great panel of leaders to talk to you today, from church plants and from missions in Africa and from Disciples of Christ Church and a Church of Christ, and from across our movement, a lot of different perspectives to talk about that. So I hope that you will watch this conversation that we're having and use that as a springboard for your own conversations about what unity looks like in our congregations as we face the challenges of living out ministry in the world.
We've been talking a lot, Becca and I, about the experience that we're having in this time. The very fact that you're watching a video of Becca and I would be that we can't meet because of the global health crisis with COVID. There's a lot of challenges that we're meeting and facing in this particularly weird and strange time. And what we're doing now, meeting like this, is one of those challenges, but there's a lot more that's going on. For myself, as a pastor here in Eugene, Oregon at Dayspring Fellowship, I found myself seeking the guidance and wisdom of fellow pastors. We have a gathering of pastors in our convention that get together and talk about how we're going to reopen, what reopening is going to look like, how we can get the right amount of people into different gathering spaces. And those conversations are difficult, but it takes a community. For me, if it weren't for our pastors group and the ability to talk about the difficulties we're going through, discussing different ways to deal with it in small congregations and large congregations, then I don't think we would have a really valid way to deal with this crisis. No matter how much you read, it's not the same as the brass tacks, the difficult decisions you have to make. How do you clean? How much time between? What do you do with your bathroom situations? These things are weird, really kind of practical issues we have to deal with, but we wouldn't be able to really think deeply about it without seeing each other's struggles. And so for me and that pastors group, when we get together, and this is all on Zoom, we talk about what we can do and how we can do it well. We hone one another and we encourage each other to do it better.
I think one of the interesting challenges and also victories in this season has been trying to figure out how to maintain ministry and connection with one another and with our congregation through a season of isolation and pandemic. Zoom has been a great platform for that. We are now doing a weekly Bible study on Zoom from our little living room space. And it's been a challenge, but it's also been a real blessing to still connect, to still see each other's faces and lift one another up in prayer, sort of in person, even though we're not really together. Another great opportunity I had, a friend of mine, she quilts, and she made a bunch of masks for her church and for the local medical community here. When she was done, when they had received their quantity that they needed, she was still ready to make masks, and so she called us up and she made about 50 masks for our congregation, and so now we have a stash of masks available for anyone who wants to come but maybe doesn't have their own mask. So that's something that we can now provide for the community, and that's just a great way that the church has been the church in this crisis.
Yep, a church united and collaborating together to make a difficult situation the best we possibly can.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's had to pastor through a pandemic. It's been an interesting challenge, but we're doing the best we can, and we couldn't do it without the support of the church.
Very true.
I think the most obvious, or maybe the greatest challenge, has been the lack of proximity. We sometimes use the phrase "absence makes the heart grow fonder," and that may be the case, but I'm not entirely sure it's always true. Being separated may cement positive feelings and affections we have for people we share long-term, deep relationships with, but in cases where those relationships are only surface level, and unfortunately that can be the case in the church a lot of the time, or maybe those relationships are just freshly forming, it may just make the heart grow forgetful. It's easy to feel fondness and camaraderie when we're face to face each week. It's significantly more challenging when we might go weeks or months without seeing those faces. What a period of time like the current COVID crisis magnifies is how essential quality communication, meaningful communication with one another is. We need to be giving our time and attention to one another outside of Sunday mornings. If we weren't before, now is the time to do it. We've really encouraged our members at the Newburg Church of Christ to take advantage of whatever means of communication they have to make those personal connections each day. Ironically, it's the moment for the church directory in many ways. And a lot of people have risen to the occasion. They make more phone calls, they write more letters. I've also invested a more significant amount of time in listening and sharing with those in the congregation that I might not have otherwise. And it's been a good reminder to our elders of how important phone calls and when they're able, visitation is. As I've seen this internally with my own congregation, it's reminded me of just how important communication with those outside of my own tradition is. We need each other. In Newburg, we have a ministerial alliance that usually meets once or twice a month, and that took a backseat for the first couple months of lockdown. But as we've started to visit over Zoom, it's been tremendously encouraging to be reminded of all the gifting and unique perspectives that God has blessed the entire church with. We need to share the wisdom that comes from that larger communion.
Hey, Kyle here. I'm the lead pastor of Generations Church in Vancouver, Washington. We are a young church plant here in Vancouver. We are just under a year old of starting weekly gatherings, and so it's been an adventure as we have gone through COVID-19. God has been at work in some really amazing ways. We've developed a greater sense of community, which we thought was going to be an initial challenge. At first, we take communion together online after we live stream our service each and every Sunday. And so it's been great to have a group of people hop online, share prayer requests, and take communion together. We also have invested in online ministry and in outreach during the season. While many people are holed up in their homes, we have continued to invest in outreach. One of the ways that we did that around Easter is we did an Egg My House event where people could request their house to be egged, where little plastic eggs would show up on their front lawn Easter morning with an Easter basket for their kids if they felt like they could not go out. And this event was actually featured in the Columbian, and we passed out over 650 baskets to kids in our community. Over 1,200 people were connected with to hear the good news of Jesus through a church just trying to bless them during Easter season. We've also seen our team really rally around the idea of spiritual conversations. Our number one goal this year as a church was to see each and every member of our core team have a certain number of spiritual conversations. And that can be conversations about church, Jesus, the universe, like some nebulous thing out there. But it's moving the ball forward in terms of getting practice and having a level of spiritual conversation, so that maybe it leads to an invitation church. Maybe it leads to sitting down and reading the Bible together. Maybe it leads to sharing the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And so we've seen a huge increase actually in spiritual conversations during this season by our team. In fact, one of our team members just this last month had 65 spiritual conversations themselves. And yes, they are still working, but just a level of hopelessness exists, a level of cynicism exists. And so they were able to, in almost every day, multiple times a day, talk about how they are finding hope in a church family, how they are finding hope in a church community through faith in Jesus, how while the world can be seen as just going to hell in a handbasket, they have been able to find a level of stability in these tough times because of relational connections through church. And this has generated questions that we have seen some of these people that this person has been talking with actually start live streaming, have set up coffees as we advance in phases. And so God is on the move. God is at work. Now,
hi everyone.
We are Joel and Mercy Brock, and we are missionaries with Missions of Hope International through CMF International in Nairobi, Kenya. And we wanted to just take a little bit to share about maintaining church unity during these challenging times, and how within our situation, how our organization has been attempting to do that.
Maintaining church unity has proven to be a challenge, but with Missions of Hope, we've had some strategies that have helped maintain some unity and learn some new strategies that will continue moving forward.
One of the biggest challenges for our organization and churches has been the government lockdown rules. Currently, no one can leave whatever city they're in, and churches are not allowed to gather in person. And there's also a big lack of trust in the government and their decision making, and also a widespread belief that if we were to just pray enough, that God wouldn't allow us to get the virus. So there's a lot of frustrations that have come with that as well. Also, neighboring East African countries are all kind of doing different strategies in tackling this situation. And so there's not a lot of consistency in the region on how things have been implemented. And the president of a neighboring country has even said that they have no virus cases at all because of prayers. So that has also made it hard when our churches are shut down here, but then they're seeing the neighbors in the neighboring country that are just going forward full steam ahead.
Some ways our organization has tried to continue the ministry of the church are through a food basket ministry by our Kenyan staff, online messages through Facebook, and text messages of devotions. One of our spiritual development officers said that online church, being a completely new concept for most churches here, saw some online churches as evil, but now they see it as another way to advance the kingdom.
So that has been a big victory. Learning new ways to use technology has been victories, and will be new tools that we will continue to use moving forward, even when things go back to whatever the new normal is going to be. There's also been a large number of people that have committed their lives to Christ through the food basket ministry that our Kenyan staff has been taking part in. While being locked down and quarantined can feel discouraging, we believe that God is going to use us all for good and allow the church to spread its reach even further through all these new tools that we have learned.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Casey Holmes and I am the worship leader here at Turner Christian Church. One of the things I've observed over the years is that the most engaging, the most unifying, and the most sustainable worship services place a strong emphasis on keeping their corporate worship corporate. They try to engage everyone in the room. They don't cherry pick anyone's preferences over another, and they make sure no one feels left behind in the worship service. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about how the body of Christ is made of many parts, and I consider it a big part of my job as a worship leader to identify those different parts, recognize that they all have different needs and different values, and try to make sure they feel they have a place in our worship service and they aren't left behind. Now, coronavirus has given us some really interesting opportunities to live this out, because here's the thing. Turner Christian Church is an especially vulnerable congregation when it comes to coronavirus. We have a lot of elderly in our church. We have a lot of families who are living with cancer patients. We have children who are severely asthmatic. We have a lot of healthcare workers and caregivers in our congregation. So even though they are healthy and their children are healthy, they are exposed to vulnerable populations on a regular basis. So from the very beginning, as soon as we learned that coronavirus was in our community, we knew that we had to be especially careful because we had an especially vulnerable congregation. Now that means that we closed our doors very early, earlier than some other churches in the area. We closed before the governor told us we had to. And now that we're reopening, we are doing so more slowly than other congregations. And that's just because we are responding to the needs of our congregation. Every congregation is different, but we know ours is especially vulnerable. So we're being extra careful. Now, when we had our online service, it was pretty accessible. We already had an online presence, but not everyone had Facebook. So we had to find some new outlets to reach that group in our congregation. Then we found a cluster who didn't have access to internet at all. So we had to find new ways to engage with them and make sure they still felt part of the body, that they could still somehow worship corporately with the rest of us and not get left behind. And now that we're into reopening, we've just been approved for phase 2, we are still being very careful and intentional about making sure even our most vulnerable members feel safe coming back to church. Later in that passage in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how the stronger parts of the body, the more prominent parts of the body, protect the vulnerable parts. And I'm taking that very seriously as we reopen, because I believe that we can achieve a very unique kind of strength and unity when our congregation is willing to make sacrifices of their comfort so that the most vulnerable parts feel safe coming back to their church home. This means that we are keeping a pretty strict capacity limit on our building. We're doing 2 services and they sit in different pews for each service. We're doing social distancing and masks. We're doing individualized communion elements. And instead of passing the offering plate, we have lock boxes where people can drop their offerings. These are all health and safety measures that can seem kind of superficial, but they're very intentional to make sure that we keep our corporate worship corporate and no one is left behind. As a worship leader, one of the most difficult decisions I had to make was eliminating congregational singing from our worship service. This was very difficult because here in Turner, we love to sing together, and frankly, we're really good at it. So that was a big sacrifice for our congregation, but we're willing to do it so that our most vulnerable parts feel safe. Luckily, Pastor Matt has been doing the Psalms this summer, so I'm finding some creative and new ways that we can engage with the Psalms without singing them. We're reciting them together, we're reading them responsively, and we're experimenting with dramatic readings with some background music and ambiance sounds, with some pictures up on the screen, trying to find these new ways to engage our senses while interacting with the Psalms in ways that we've never done before. And it's been really wonderful to see our congregation come together and make sacrifices so that we can build unity, even though we're sitting farther apart than we've ever been, because we're keeping our corporate worship as corporate and inclusive as possible, because we're taking care of our most vulnerable parts. And that's how we're building unity during coronavirus.
Hello, my name is Pastor Zane Ridings, a Disciples of Christ pastor in Lebanon, Oregon. And I want to make an attempt at answering some of these questions about what it's been like attempting to build and maintain church unity during COVID-19. And it needs a little bit of context in my setting because we have two main ways that we really work with other churches and attempt to build unity here. And the first is through a community soup kitchen that is housed out of our building. And then the second has been through a very interesting and vibrant event that takes place at the end of each month called Hymns and Hops, which is a hymn sing that takes place at a brew pub. Now, the first challenges with our ecumenical outreach work have been that we went from being able to have up to 60 volunteers involved each week to about 5 or 6 every week because of the need to keep the kitchen closed. So the struggle in maintaining unity and connection alongside of that ministry work has been keeping our volunteers plugged in and involved, even though they may not be able to actually come into the actual kitchen right now. And we've seen some marvelous avenues of unity come from that, even to the point of a Church of Christ church in town that split from us back in the 50s, them becoming highly involved in the soup kitchen, and us being able to have honest and frank conversations about the fact that our communities didn't always either get along or like each other, but we are now doing God's work together, feeding people, and hopefully kind of cutting across some of those old difficulties and some of those old pains so that we can be church together, even though we might worship differently and talk about some things quite differently. We're both Christian communities and we both fall inside of the Stone Campbell stream. And then finally, we share together that love and passion for serving others because of our Christian faith. So there's definitely been some challenges, but there have been some victories there. And we also unfortunately had our soup kitchen manager, who was a member of that other church, passed away suddenly inside of all of this. So the two churches have been really coming together to support one another. Us in the sense that they just lost a vibrant community member and we lost our soup kitchen manager. And then with our church, just trying to support them in this time and continue to bring in their volunteers to build some amazing connections. Now, with the hymn sing, we have not yet been able to figure out a way to do that either virtually or distant, but those connections that we've built from that relationship and from that event have continued to be avenues for unity and for ecumenical collaboration inside of our community. The good news is that we're hoping to find some ways to continue that event down here in Lebanon. And then we've also been trying to figure out some creative ways to bring that event to other places in our broader community and here in the Northwest. So I thank you for listening to me for a moment, and hopefully you share some of that same excitement, how small things such as communal ministries and events can be avenues for unity and for collaboration, when before there may have only been pain or dislike. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this forum. I know there's a lot more stories out there in our region and across the country and across the world of churches that have responded in fruitful and creative ways to continue to build the kingdom and to build unity in the church during the COVID crisis. I encourage you to continue the conversation, continue talking about how you have been able to respond to this and how churches can respond to it. Because the more we talk about unity as a value that's important in our churches, the more likely we are to respond to unexpected situations like COVID-19 in ways that unite the church. So we can encourage you to continue that conversation. You can also watch the 5th session of our workshop, which is another forum discussing the church's role as a unifying force in response to the current dialogue on racism in our country and around our world. So I encourage you to watch that forum as well and participate in that part of the conversation. Thanks so much for joining us, and God bless.